The first snowflakes fell on Margaret Chen's ranch 3 days before Thanksgiving, which should have been impossible. In 43 years of living in the Texas Hill Country, she'd seen late November snow exactly twice, and never more than a dusting that melted by noon. These flakes were different. They fell thick and deliberate, accumulating on the fence posts and the dormant grass with an unsettling permanency. Margaret stood on her porch, watching the transformation of the landscape, one hand wrapped around a coffee mug that had gone cold, the other unconsciously touching the worn wedding band she still wore, though David had been gone 18 months now. The weatherman on the radio had used words like unprecedented and catastrophic, but weathermen always exaggerated. What troubled her more than the snow was the fact that her hay supply, which should have lasted until March, was looking uncomfortably thin. She'd sold more cattle than planned after David died, but she kept enough that she'd need every bale she had. The new storage method she'd tried this year, based on an agricultural extension article she'd found while sorting through David's bookmarked websites, had seemed eccentric at the time. Now, watching the snow intensify, she wondered if it would matter at all. The structure sat 200 yards from the barn, and even from this distance Margaret could see it was already half buried. The article had called it a hay igloo, or sometimes a hay vault, a technique borrowed from Scandinavian farmers who dealt with moisture problems in their coastal climates. The principle was simple: stack hay bales in a specific circular pattern, leave ventilation at the bottom, cover the top with tarps weighted by more bales, and let the outer layer compost slightly to create a weather-resistant shell. David had been fascinated by alternative farming methods, always reading about some new approach or traditional technique that modern agriculture had forgotten. In the months after the funeral, Margaret had worked through his projects one by one, partly because they needed doing, and partly because it felt like finishing conversations they'd never completed. The Hay Igloo had been his last bookmarked article. She'd built it in October with the help of Ramon, the teenager from the next ranch over who helped with heavy work. It had taken 3 days and nearly 400 small square bales, arranged in a circle 20 feet across, stacked inward and upward until they formed a dome. The neighbors had been polite about it, which in rural Texas meant they thought she was losing her mind, but were too well-mannered to say so directly. By the evening of the second day, the snow had accumulated to 8 inches, and the temperature was dropping toward 10 degrees. Margaret's phone had lost signal around sunset, but the battery radio in the kitchen still worked, crackling out increasingly alarmed weather reports. The governors of Texas and Oklahoma had declared states of emergency. The power grid was experiencing unprecedented strain. Rolling blackouts were possible, then probable, then inevitable. Margaret had lived through ice storms and heat waves and the occasional tornado warning, but this felt different. This felt like the climate itself had shifted, like something fundamental had broken. She checked on her cattle twice before full dark, counting heads in the pasture closest to the house, where she'd consolidated the herd. 32 Herefords, their breath steaming in the frigid air, already clustering near the hay she'd thrown out that morning. They'd go through her barn supply in a week at this rate, maybe less if the cold persisted. The Hay Igloo, if it had survived the moisture and the snow load, held another 3 months' worth of feed. If it had collapsed or rotted, she'd be selling cattle at a loss in the worst market conditions in a decade. The power went out on the third night and stayed out. Margaret had a generator that could run the well pump and a few lights, but fuel was precious and the roads were already impassable. She rationed its use, running it twice a day to pump water and check the freezer. The house was old, but well insulated, and she had David's elaborate wood stove installation that could heat the main living area indefinitely, as long as she had wood, which she did. The days developed a rhythm. Wake before dawn, start the fire, check the generator, feed the cattle, break ice in the water troughs, check the cattle again, bring in more wood, maintain the fire, sleep in layers of clothing with every blanket she owned. The sky stayed gray and close, and the snow continued falling, sometimes light, sometimes heavy, never stopping entirely. By the end of the first week, the accumulation was 3 feet on level ground and much deeper where it drifted. The hay igloo had become a white mound, indistinguishable from the landscape except for the faint circular outline visible from certain angles. On the 9th day, Margaret woke to silence so complete it felt aggressive. No wind, no falling snow, no sound from the cattle in the pasture. She dressed quickly and pushed through the snow to the fence line. The herd was gone. For one irrational moment, she thought they'd died. All of them, overnight. But then she saw the tracks leading toward the tree line to the south, deep furrows where the animals had forced their way through drifts. She followed the trail for 20 minutes, her progress agonizingly slow in snow that sometimes reached her thighs until she found them clustered in a hollow near the creek. 2 calves were down, lying too still. The others looked at her with the patient misery of animals past complaining. The barn hay was gone. She'd been rationing it carefully, but 32 cattle in sub-zero temperatures went through feed faster than any calculation suggested. She needed the hay igloo now, needed it to have worked, needed David's last bookmarked article to have been more than eccentric optimism. Getting back to the ranch house took an hour. Margaret collected the equipment she needed, a hay hook, heavy gloves, the tractor with the front loader, which she'd been keeping in the barn with an engine heater running off the generator. The tractor started reluctantly, coughing black smoke in the cold air before settling into a rough idle. She drove it toward the white mound that had been the hay igloo, trying not to think about the calves she'd left behind, or the timeline that was narrowing with every hour. The snow had drifted against the structure's north side, creating a wall nearly 6 feet high. Margaret began clearing it with the loader, working carefully, aware that if the structure had collapsed, she might be about to dump several tons of frozen rotted hay onto the ground. The outer bales, when she finally exposed them, were white with frost and compressed from the snow load. She climbed off the tractor and approached on foot, pulling at the nearest bale with the hay hook. It resisted, stuck to its neighbors, and she had to work the hook in deeper, pulling with her full weight. When it finally came free, she nearly fell backward. The bale was intact. More than intact, it was dry. Margaret pulled away 3 more bales from the outer layer, her hands shaking despite the heavy gloves, and each one told the same story. The outer 18 inches had composted exactly as the article described, forming a dense, weather-resistant shell. Inside that barrier, the hay was preserved as if it had been stored in a climate-controlled barn. She began laughing, a sound that startled her in the silent landscape, and then she was crying, still holding the hay hook, standing in front of David's last project. The design had worked. Centuries of Scandinavian farming wisdom filtered through an agricultural extension article and executed by a grieving widow in the Texas Hill Country had produced exactly what it promised. She had feed, her cattle would survive. She loaded the tractor bucket with bales and drove toward the hollow where the herd waited, and if the calves were already lost, at least she could save the rest. The winter continued for another month, establishing records that would be cited in climate studies for years. The governor toured the devastation by helicopter. The president declared a major disaster area. The power grid's failure became the subject of legislative hearings and criminal investigations. On Margaret's ranch, life narrowed to the essential cycle of feeding and survival. She worked through the hay igloo methodically, pulling bales from the interior and letting the outer shell remain intact, which provided continued protection for what remained. The structure's original 400 bales fed her herd through January and into February, when the first thaw finally came. She lost 3 calves total, which was heartbreaking, but represented a survival rate her neighbors couldn't match. Ramon's family lost half their cattle. The Hendersons to the west had to sell everything at distressed prices just to pay for emergency feed that never arrived. Margaret's phone service returned before the roads cleared, and the first calls were from neighbors asking about her hay supply, wondering how she'd managed. Could she spare any bales? They'd pay whatever she asked. The article appeared in the county newspaper first, written by a reporter who'd been documenting the winter's impact on rural communities. Local ranchers' innovative hay storage method proves revolutionary during historic winter, the headline read. Then a regional farm journal picked it up, and then the Agricultural Extension Service that had originally published David's article contacted her for an interview. Margaret had never sought attention and initially refused all requests, but the extension agent was persistent. "People need to know this works," the woman said. "We've got ranchers across 3 states who lost everything. If we'd had more people using this method, the losses would have been a fraction of what they were." So Margaret agreed to a site visit and demonstration, and in April, when the snow had melted and the grass was returning, she found herself hosting a crowd of farmers and ranchers and extension agents, all gathered around the remnants of the hay igloo, which still held 70 bales in perfect condition. She explained the stacking pattern and the ventilation principles, showing photographs she'd taken during construction. The visitors took notes and measurements and pictures from every angle. What Margaret didn't mention during the demonstration, what she saved for her own private knowledge, was the morning she'd first pulled hay from the igloo and found herself crying in the snow. That moment belonged to her and David, to the partnership that continued even after death in the form of bookmarked articles and unfinished projects. The hay igloo had saved her herd, but it had also validated something more fundamental: David's instinct for seeing value in unconventional approaches, his belief that old wisdom and new challenges could be reconciled, his conviction that careful attention to detail mattered more than conventional thinking. These were the principles that had guided their 43 years together, and they had guided her through the first winter alone. The reporters and agricultural experts who visited in the following months were interested in the technical specifications and the replication potential. Margaret understood this was important, understood that knowledge needed to be shared to be useful. But she also understood that some parts of the story couldn't be measured or photographed or reduced to stacking patterns and moisture equations. The calls started coming in May after the second Agricultural Journal article and the segment on the Regional Farm Report television show. The first one sounded professional and friendly, a man identifying himself as Marcus Reeves from Trinity Agricultural Ventures, calling to congratulate her on her innovative approach and discuss potential opportunities. Margaret listened politely while he explained that his company specialized in bringing revolutionary farming techniques to scale, and they saw enormous potential in her hay storage method. They'd like to send a team to document the structure, perhaps interview her about the development process, discuss licensing arrangements. Margaret said she'd developed nothing. She'd simply followed instructions from an existing article, and she wasn't interested in licensing arrangements for information that was already publicly available. Marcus Reeves's tone remained friendly, but acquired a slight edge. He said she was being too modest, that her specific implementation represented substantial innovation, and really they should have a more detailed conversation. Margaret said she'd think about it and ended the call. The same company called back 3 days later, and then again a week after that, each time with slightly more pressure in the supposedly casual conversation. The letter arrived in June, delivered by courier service, even though her ranch was 20 miles from the nearest UPS depot. Trinity Agricultural Ventures was pleased to formally offer her a consulting arrangement that would involve a one-time payment of $50,000 in exchange for exclusive documentation rights and her participation in training programs they intended to develop. The letter emphasized that time was of the essence as they were moving quickly to establish their position in what they called the climate-adaptive agriculture sector. Margaret read the letter twice, then filed it in the cabinet where she kept ranch records. She'd spent enough years married to a man who read fine print carefully to recognize when a contract was designed to sound generous while taking more than it gave. Exclusive documentation rights meant she'd be prohibited from sharing information freely. The consulting arrangement meant they owned her time and her story. The $50,000 was presented as compensation, but functioned as consideration in a binding agreement that would prevent her from talking to anyone else about techniques that weren't hers to begin with. When the third call came, Margaret was ready. She told Marcus Reeves that she wasn't interested in any arrangement that restricted information sharing, that the hay igloo design belonged to the Agricultural Extension Service and to the generations of Scandinavian farmers who developed it, and that she had no intention of helping anyone monetize public knowledge. There was a pause on the line, longer than conversational rhythm allowed, and when Reeves spoke again, the friendliness had evaporated entirely. He said that was unfortunate, that they'd hoped to work cooperatively, but they wanted her to understand they were proceeding with their plans regardless of her participation. They documented multiple implementations of hay igloo structures over the past month, including several by ranchers she'd personally advised. Those ranchers had been more amenable to collaboration. Trinity Agricultural Ventures would be moving forward with a comprehensive training program and licensing system. And while they would have preferred her endorsement, it wasn't necessary. Margaret said that was fine with her, and ended the call. She didn't mention the conversation to anyone, though she thought about it frequently over the following week. The next contact came from a different direction. a rancher named Tom Beckworth, called from 3 counties over, apologetic and uncomfortable. He'd been one of the people at her demonstration in April, had taken detailed notes, and built his own hay igloo for the coming winter. 2 days ago, he'd received a cease and desist letter from Trinity Agricultural Ventures claiming his hay storage structure infringed on their proprietary method. The letter demanded he either dismantle the structure or enter into a licensing agreement that would cost him $2,000 annually. Tom wanted to know if Margaret had sold them the design, if she'd known this was coming, if there was anything he should do besides hire a lawyer he couldn't afford. Margaret felt something cold settle in her chest as she listened. She told Tom she'd sold nothing to anyone, that Trinity had no legitimate claim to a technique that had been public knowledge for decades, and that he should ignore the letter. But she wasn't sure that was good advice, wasn't sure what legal weight a cease and desist letter carried, wasn't sure what a company with enough resources to hire lawyers and send letters to ranchers across multiple counties might do next. She called the Agricultural Extension Office and asked to speak with Dr. Patricia Morrison, the agent who'd originally interviewed her and written the expanded article about the hay igloo method. Dr. Morrison listened to Margaret's summary of Trinity's activities, and her silence after Margaret finished speaking was eloquent. Finally, she said the Extension Service had also received communications from Trinity Agricultural Ventures, threatening legal action if they continued distributing information about hay igloo construction. The service's legal counsel was reviewing the matter, but the initial opinion was that Trinity had somehow secured a business method patent covering specific aspects of circular hay stacking despite the technique's obvious prior art. How they'd obtained such a patent was unclear, but the fact that it existed meant fighting it would be expensive and uncertain. The Extension Service was considering removing their hay igloo resources from public distribution rather than face litigation. Dr. Morrison sounded exhausted and angry in equal measure. She said this wasn't why she'd gone into agricultural education, to watch someone weaponize patents against farmers trying to survive. Margaret thanked her and sat in her kitchen for a long time afterward, looking at the photograph of David she kept on the windowsill, wondering what he would do. The answer came to her gradually over the following days. David would have researched the problem systematically, gathering information from multiple sources, building a complete picture before taking action. Margaret started with the patent itself, which was publicly accessible through the government database. Reading it required learning a new vocabulary of claims and specifications, but the core was clear enough. Trinity Agricultural Ventures had filed for and received a patent covering a system and method for weather-resistant agricultural storage utilizing circular hay bale arrangement with composting outer layer. The patent's filing date was February, right in the middle of the historic winter, and it had been expedited through a fast-track process typically reserved for innovations with immediate public benefit. The prior art section made no mention of Scandinavian farming techniques or existing agricultural extension publications. It cited only a handful of tangentially related patents about hay storage. Either Trinity's lawyers had done remarkably poor research, or they deliberately omitted inconvenient prior art, gambling that no one would challenge a patent expensive enough to defend. Margaret spent a week reading about patent challenges and prior art invalidation. The legal processes were complex and intimidating, designed for corporations with teams of attorneys rather than individual ranchers with high school educations. But the fundamental principle was straightforward. If you could prove a patent covered something that already existed in public knowledge before the filing date, the patent was invalid. The agricultural extension article David had bookmarked was dated 3 years before Trinity's filing. The techniques it described were documented in Scandinavian farming journals going back decades. Margaret had photographs from her October construction months before Trinity's filing date. The demonstration she'd hosted in April had been attended by more than 50 people who'd taken detailed notes and measurements. The subsequent articles and television segment had been published before Trinity received their patent. The prior art wasn't just strong, it was overwhelming. But knowing that and proving it in a legal proceeding that might cost tens of thousands of dollars were different things entirely. She found the lawyer through Dr. Morrison, who connected her with a legal clinic at the state university that specialized in agricultural law and intellectual property issues. The attorney's name was Sarah Chen, no relation, though Margaret found the coincidence oddly comforting. And she was young enough to be Margaret's daughter, but spoke with a precision that suggested considerable expertise. Sarah listened to the full story, asked detailed questions about timelines and documentation, and then leaned back in her office chair with an expression that Margaret recognized from her own experience. Someone who just had their worst suspicions confirmed. Sarah said that Trinity Agricultural Ventures had established a pattern over the past 5 years of securing questionable patents on traditional farming methods, then aggressively licensing them to farmers who often paid rather than fight. The amounts were usually small enough that litigation didn't make economic sense, but large enough that they added up to substantial revenue across hundreds or thousands of farmers. The IGLOO patent was their most ambitious effort yet, covering a technique that potentially affected thousands of ranchers across the Great Plains and Southwest. If they could enforce it, they'd collect millions in licensing fees for something they hadn't invented. Sarah said that challenging the patent would require filing a petition for inter partes review with the Patent Trial and Appeal Board, a process that involved substantial documentation and legal argument, but was significantly less expensive than federal court litigation. The legal clinic could handle the case pro bono if Margaret was willing to be the named petitioner, but Margaret should understand this would make her the target of Trinity's attention. They would likely escalate their pressure, might file counterclaims, would certainly attempt to make the process as uncomfortable and expensive as possible to discourage others from challenging their patents. Margaret asked what would happen if nobody challenged it, and Sarah's answer was blunt. Trinity would continue extracting money from farmers indefinitely. The Agricultural Extension Service would stop distributing useful information out of fear, and traditional farming knowledge would be gradually privatized by whoever was aggressive enough to patent it first. Margaret thought about Tom Beckworth and the cease and desist letter, about the calves she'd lost during the winter, about David's bookmarked article, and the principle that knowledge should be shared freely. She told Sarah to file the petition. Trinity's response came within a week of the filing, and it wasn't legal. Marcus Reeves called her directly, his voice tight with controlled anger, and said she was making a serious mistake. The patent was completely legitimate, reviewed and approved by federal examiners, and her challenge was frivolous harassment that would result in sanctions. Trinity had invested substantial resources in developing training programs and infrastructure to support farmers, and her actions were threatening to undermine crucial agricultural innovation. Margaret let him talk until he ran down, then said quietly that she'd built her hay igloo following instructions that predated his patent by years, that generations of Scandinavian farmers had used the same techniques, and that calling public knowledge innovation didn't make it true. Reeves said she clearly didn't understand how patents worked, how business worked, how vulnerable she was making herself. Trinity had deep resources and experienced legal teams. The clinic representing her was a group of students playing lawyer. This would not end well for her. Margaret thanked him for his concern and ended the call. The next communication was a letter from Trinity's law firm. Not a cease and desist, but something more aggressive. A demand for compensation covering their development costs for the hay igloo method, along with a warning that continued opposition would result in counterclaims for defamation and tortious interference with business relationships. The amount they demanded was $75,000, presumably calculated to be large enough that paying it would be ruinous, but fighting it would be more expensive. Sarah filed a response dismissing the demand as baseless, but she also told Margaret that Trinity was doing exactly what she'd predicted, trying to make the fight too costly to continue. The legal clinic could handle the patent challenge, but defending against additional claims would require resources they didn't have. Margaret would need a litigation attorney if Trinity escalated further, and litigation attorneys were expensive. Margaret asked how expensive, and Sarah's answer made her stomach clench. Potentially hundreds of thousands of dollars, depending on how far Trinity wanted to push. Margaret thanked her and drove home thinking about numbers, about the ranch's value versus Trinity's apparent resources, about how fights got won and lost. She found herself in David's office that evening, going through the files he'd kept, looking for something she couldn't quite name. David had been meticulous about documentation, keeping records of everything from cattle vaccinations to equipment maintenance to property surveys. In a drawer dedicated to legal and financial documents, Margaret found the folder labeled Mineral Rights, TBD. She'd forgotten about it, forgotten the geology survey David had commissioned 2 years before his death, when natural gas exploration was expanding into their area. The survey had identified potential formations, but concluded that exploitation would require horizontal drilling from adjacent properties. David had filed the information away as interesting but not immediately relevant. Margaret read through the report now with different eyes, seeing not theoretical gas deposits but leverage, seeing not geological data but resources that Trinity Agricultural Ventures might want if they knew about it, seeing a card she could play if necessary. She made copies of everything and added them to the box of documentation Sarah was building for the patent challenge. The inter partes review petition went forward with 50 pages of prior art documentation, including the agricultural extension article, historical references to Scandinavian hay storage methods, Margaret's construction photographs, and testimony from a dozen ranchers who'd attended her April demonstration. Sarah was confident the patent would be invalidated, The prior art was simply too strong to ignore, but the Patent Trial and Appeal Board's timeline was measured in months, and Trinity wasn't waiting. In August, 3 more ranches received cease and desist letters. In September, Trinity filed a federal lawsuit against Tom Beckworth for patent infringement, clearly choosing him as an example to terrorize others. Tom called Margaret in tears, saying he couldn't fight this, couldn't afford attorneys, would have to dismantle his hay storage and probably sell his ranch. Margaret told him to hold on, told him she was working on something, though she wasn't sure what exactly she was working on beyond stubborn refusal to let Trinity win. The breakthrough came from an unexpected direction. Dr. Morrison, from the Agricultural Extension Service, contacted Margaret with news that an investigative reporter from a national agricultural publication had started looking into Trinity's business practices. The reporter, Julia Vance, wanted to interview Margaret about her experience. Margaret was hesitant. Publicity had brought nothing but trouble so far. But Dr. Morrison said this was different. Julia specialized in exposing agricultural fraud and predatory business practices. If anyone could shine light on what Trinity was doing, it was her. Margaret agreed to the interview, and Julia Vance arrived at the ranch 3 days later, a woman in her 50s, with a digital recorder and a notebook already half filled with research. She didn't need much prompting. She'd been tracking Trinity for 2 years, investigating their pattern of patent acquisitions and enforcement. The Hay IGLOO patent was the most egregious example yet, but it fit a clear pattern. Identify traditional techniques experiencing renewed interest, file patents before farmers understood what was happening, enforce aggressively against vulnerable targets. Trinity had built a business model on legal intimidation and gambling that farmers couldn't afford to fight back. Julia's article appeared in October titled "Patent Trolls Target Farmers: How One Company is Privatizing Agricultural Knowledge." It detailed Trinity's operations comprehensively, naming executives, documenting their enforcement pattern, and featuring Margaret's case prominently. The article included interviews with patent law experts who called Trinity's practices ethically bankrupt and contrary to the purpose of patent law. It highlighted the prior art invalidating the Hay IGLOO patent and questioned how such a patent had been approved in the first place. The response was immediate. Agricultural organizations issued statements condemning Trinity's practices. State legislators from farming districts called for investigations. The Patent and Trademark Office announced a review of its fast-track approval processes, and most significantly, 3 major law firms specializing in intellectual property litigation offered to represent Tom Beckworth and other targeted farmers pro bono, specifically to create legal precedent against agricultural patent trolling. Trinity's stock price, which Margaret hadn't known existed until she saw it mentioned in follow-up coverage, dropped 30% in 2 days. Marcus Reeves stopped calling. The demand letter about compensation went unanswered from Trinity's side. In November, Trinity quietly abandoned its lawsuit against Tom Beckworth. In December, the Patent Trial and Appeal Board issued a preliminary finding that Trinity's Hay IGLOO patent was invalid due to overwhelming prior art, a finding that would become final after a comment period. In January, exactly 1 year after the worst of the historic winter, Trinity Agricultural Ventures announced it was dissolving its agricultural patents division and focusing on other business areas. The cease and desist letter stopped. The licensing demand stopped. Farmers who'd paid licensing fees began receiving refunds as part of settlement agreements. And Margaret's phone started ringing again, this time with ranchers calling to thank her, to ask advice about hay storage, to share their own survival stories from the winter. The hay igloo she built that second fall in October again because the timing had felt right the first time was slightly larger than the original. She'd learned small refinements through a year of experience, adjustments to the ventilation pattern and the bale arrangement. Ramon helped with the heavy work again, now confident enough in the technique that he was building one on his family's ranch. The neighbors, who'd been politely skeptical the previous year, brought questions and cameras. Margaret walked them through each step, explaining the principles David had read about in that agricultural extension article, demonstrating the stacking pattern, sharing what she'd learned about moisture management and structural integrity. She took no payment and requested no credit. When people asked why she'd fought Trinity so hard when settling would have been easier and cheaper, she said simply that some things weren't for sale. That knowledge belonged to the people who could use it. The winter came early again that year, though not as severe as the previous one. The hay igloo performed exactly as designed, feeding her herd through February without any losses. In March, when the grass returned and the cattle could graze again, Margaret stood in the same spot on her porch where she'd watched those first impossible snowflakes fall 16 months earlier. The landscape was transformed again, but this time with life instead of snow, with green instead of white. David's photograph was still on the windowsill inside, and she thought about how his last bookmarked article had rippled outward in ways neither of them could have predicted, how a simple farming technique had become a battleground over who owned knowledge, how persistence and documentation and the willingness to fight had mattered more than money or patents or legal intimidation. The hay igloo stood in the pasture, its outer layer composting gently, its interior preserving next year's feed. It was nothing special, really, just bales arranged in a circle, following instructions published decades ago, maintained by someone who understood that some innovations weren't innovations at all but remembrances, that the newest solutions were sometimes the oldest ones, and that survival often came down to knowing when to hold on and when to let go, when to adapt and when to preserve, when to stay quiet and when to fight.